Becky is the recipient of Distinguished Scientific Contributions Award from the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading in 2014. Perhaps Becky is well known for her studies on psycholinguistic analysis of spelling of children and adults, which has advanced the new field of research and has stimulated research in different orthographies such as Hebrew, Spanish, and Chinese. Additionally, Becky has made significant contributions on dialect and spelling, difference between drawing and writing among very young children, as well as sound representation among hard of hearing and cochlear implanted children. Her research has shown that young children have the knowledge of writing at a very early age, long before the formal instruction begins, and this finding is true not only among English-speaking children, but also among Hebrew, Spanish, and Chinese-speaking children. The title of her presentation is How Children Learn to Spell. Please help me welcome Dr. Treiman.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the nice introduction, Walt. I'm very happy to be there. I've never been to Texas A&M before, so this is a nice trip, and it's actually a lot warmer than it is. So I'm going to be talking today about how children learn to spell. First, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the nature of writing systems and also the nature of the English writing system, because all of the work I'm going to be talking about is about how children learn to spell in English. And so with that background, then we'll go on to look at some studies of the topic. Now, human beings have a remarkable method of communication, very powerful, which is language. This allows us to communicate about any type of thought or experience, past or future. So, spoken language has many benefits, but it has at least one important drawback, which is that it fades very quickly without any special type of technology. So using spoken language, we can communicate with people in the same room, like right now, but we can't communicate with people in another place or another century. So there's a need to develop some kind of more permanent type of communication system that would broaden the range. And for this reason, people have tried to develop visual methods of communication. So one idea about visual communication would be to try to communicate ideas directly. This is a symbol that I saw the other day in the airport. You've probably all seen things like these. And even if you've never seen it before, you can get an idea. Okay, there's somebody kind of running towards somewhere. It's a sign for exit. So this is a kind of visual communication. It's called semasiography, and that comes from the Greek word for meaning and the Greek word for writing. So it's an attempt to convey meaning directly. So it works pretty well here. You guys familiar with this symbol? Right, you might see it on your blouse. It says, do not put it in water, do not wash it, maybe you should take it to the dry cleaners. Again, we can communicate not by virtue of a language or specific words, but we're communicating a general idea. So semasiography is kind of similar to art, but it's more standardized. It doesn't go through language. So this is great for communicating certain simple kinds of ideas, but if you wanted to use a semasiographic system to say, for example, I wish I hadn't had 2 pieces of that chocolate cake yesterday, it'd be really hard to communicate that using semasiography. So people have developed other methods of communication visually. Glottography. Glottis meaning tongue or speech. This is communication, writing of speech. This is communicating visually through a language. And all writing systems in use today are glottographic. They piggyback off a language. The units of writing represent units of a language. So all modern writing systems are based on a specific spoken language. And so even though writing systems differ in a lot of ways when we look at them, they're all glottographic. Here are some examples from specific writing systems. Anybody recognize this one? This is Korean here. This is Chinese. I put this for Malta,
Canada.
Canada, and English as well. So when you look at these examples of different writing systems, you see many, many differences. They all look very different. But in fact, all of them are glottographic. They all represent a specific language. The units in each of these represent units of a specific language. So there is this deep underlying similarity in how different writing systems function. So all modern writing is glottographic. It all represents units of a specific language. There are differences, though, in the level of language that writing represents. So writing systems map onto spoken language at different levels. Some writing systems represent what are called morphemes, and those are basic units of meaning. So for example, in the English word cats, we have two morphemes, cat plus the plural morpheme, sa. So in some writing systems, there would be a separate symbol for each morpheme. In Chinese, roughly speaking, is logographic. There are other writing systems where each of the symbols represents a syllable. So we would have a separate unit for each syllable. The type of writing system that I'm going to be concentrating on today is an alphabet. And in an alphabet, each symbol, each letter, represents a phoneme. A phoneme is defined as the smallest unit of sound that can make a difference in meaning. So for example, cat versus bat. K is a phoneme, B is a different phoneme. So in an alphabet, each individual letter, roughly speaking, represents a phoneme. I'm going to be focusing on how children learn English, so let me say a little bit more about alphabetic writing systems in general, and then English in particular. So as we talked about, the individual units of alphabetic writing systems represent phonemes. Generally, the letters are arranged along a line. Could be vertical, could be horizontal. If it's horizontal, it could be left to right or right to left, but it's always along a line. And in most alphabetic writing systems, although not all, words are demarcated by having spaces or other units between them. The English writing system is largely alphabetic, but it is not as regular as some other alphabetic systems, such as, for example, Finnish. There are a number of complexities in the relationships between the letters and the phonemes. And some of these complexities are due to the fact that any spoken language changes over generations. So we talk differently, we pronounce sounds differently than our grandparents did. Writing does change over time, but much more slowly than speech changes. And because of the different pace of change of writing and speech, complexities arise in how the letters relate to the phonemes. So let me give you a specific example of that. Let's take the word write. Why does this have a W-R at the beginning? Does anybody know the answer to that? It's actually because in the past, it was pronounced with a cluster. It was a w-r cluster, so the sound changed, but the spelling did not change. What about the E on the end? Anybody know why that's there? At one time, there was actually an O sound at the end of the word, and there was a whole change in the vowel pronunciations of English, but the spelling again remained the same. So now we have a word where the spelling is related in a more complex way to the pronunciation than used to be the case. So because of sound change as well as other factors, we end up with a situation in English where a number of letters have more than one possible sound, a number of phonemes have more than one possible spelling. But in many cases, the context in which the letter or the sound occurs, which sounds come before, which sounds come after, whether it's a beginning of the word, whether it's the end of the word, the context can help in choosing among the possibilities. So there are a number of different options. But if we consider the surrounding letters or the surrounding sounds, that can often help to specify which option is correct. So let me give you a specific example of that. Let's take the letter group OO. If you were to talk to a child, how do you pronounce OO? You'd probably say it's oo, right? And indeed, in most words, it is oo. But there are a number of words where OO is book, like took. Is it just a random set of words where it's OO? No, it tends to be before K. It tends to be in a specific context. So if you take context into account, you have a better chance of knowing whether you should use the oo pronunciation or whether you should use the pronunciation. And in fact, the great majority of words with OO before K do have the pronunciation. There's only one exception to that. Anybody know what it is? Spook. But all the other words with OOK have book, took, forsook, etc. So by considering context, we have a much better chance of pronouncing the word correctly than if we didn't consider context. So this is an example for the reading direction, and we have the same kind of thing operating in spelling as well. So when we look at English on the surface, we say, oh, it's very irregular, there's many pronunciations, there's many spellings, but in fact, context can often help. Another characteristic of English that makes it seem less regular on the surface, but is a sign of some deeper underlying regularity, is the fact that a morpheme, a unit of meaning, often tends to retain its spelling in different words when its pronunciation changes. And this means that the links between letters and pronunciations are more complex, but there is a consistent link between the spelling of the morpheme and the morpheme itself. So let me give you an example of this. Let's take the sound D and the letter D. So most of the time, the sound D is spelled with the letter D, like in darn, or hard, or barred. But here's an exception. The past tense barred, it's spelled with ED. So if you look at that purely at the level of phonemes, you'd say it's an exception, it makes things complex. But why is it spelled as ED? Right, it's because it's past tense morpheme. And any time we have the past tense morpheme in English, or just about any time, it's spelled as ED. So there's a more consistent link at the level of the morpheme. So the conclusion that I want to draw about the English writing system is that it is not as chaotic and unprincipled as many people think that it is. There are a lot of patterns within it. Conditioning by context, conditioning by morphology. These patterns do exist. They are probabilistic in many cases and not all renowned. It's not that every single word follows a pattern. But in many cases, there are patterns that hold a pretty high proportion of the time. And these patterns can help us to read words and to spell words. So given this background, I've talked a little bit about writing systems in general. I've talked a little bit about the English writing system in particular. Now I want to move to the question of how children learn to spell in English. So I'm going to be focusing on children, and I'm going to be focusing on children who are learning English as their first language. But before we get into that, we need to talk about why it's important to study spelling development. And I guess from the fact that you all are here, you think that it is probably important. But a lot of people would say, well, no, we have spell checkers nowadays. Why should we even teach kids to spell? Well, one answer to that question is that spell checkers do not solve all spelling problems. I don't know if this is a true story or not. You might have heard about it, but somebody who turned in a paper and they spell checked it before they turned it in, and the spell checker didn't recognize their name, and so they changed the spelling of their name. That may not be a true story, but spell checkers are not a panacea. Even people who are good readers can have continuing difficulty with spelling. Spelling is intrinsically more difficult than reading is. somebody who has difficulty with spelling and who has to devote a lot of attention to the spellings of individual words has less attention to devote to higher level composing processes. Another good reason to look at spelling is that the kinds of spellings that a child produces or a second language learner produces can provide some good insights into what that person knows about the writing system, into their present and potential future literacy skills. And so I'll get back to that later in the talk, talking about different ways to assess spelling to get the most information out of it. Less research, however, has been done on spelling than on reading. So it's important, it can provide us with a lot of information, but we don't know as much about it as we do about reading development. Okay, so I think those are all good reasons why we should take a look at spelling development. The traditional view about spelling development in English is that the only way for children to really learn how to spell is to memorize by rote visual memorization, the spellings of specific words. Learn about this whole word is spelled like this whole word is spelled like that. And this idea about spelling follows from the common view that the English writing system is so chaotic and so unprincipled that the only way to spell is by pure rote visual memorization. As we've seen, however, the English writing system is not as unprincipled as commonly thought. So even though this view is discredited now among researchers, it continues to have a big influence on instruction. So it's still the case that a common way of teaching spelling is to give children a list of words on Monday and ask them to memorize those words for a test on Friday. And in many cases, the only guidance that they're given is, well, just memorize them, copy them over and over. And in many cases, the words in a list are not chosen because they have any linguistic or orthographic features in common. It might be a list of words all related to a particular topic that the class is studying, but they might not have anything in common linguistically. So this has traditionally been the most common way of teaching spelling. That began to be questioned by researchers beginning in the 1970s, when it was discovered that young children will sometimes invent their own spellings for words. So if a child is inventing spellings, they're not memorizing them. Something is going on other than rote memorization. This work began in the 1970s. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Charles Reed, who documented invented spelling in young children who were starting to do this before they went to school. Precocious children were doing this. Reed focused on some of the linguistic factors that were causing children to invent the particular spellings that they did. Carol Chomsky, Noam Chomsky's wife, interestingly, looked at invented spelling as well. She focused on the pedagogical implications. So here is one of the first invented spellings that Charles Reed found. This was posted by a boy on his father's office door. Anybody read this?
Don't make noise here.
Don't make noise. My daddy works here. So this boy had not seen people spelling these words this way. This is not how adults spell. He invented these spellings, and take note of the particular types of errors that he's making. M-A-K, for example, for make, D-O-T for don't. We're going to come back to the linguistic reasons behind some of these a little bit later. In Charles Reed's research, he was looking at precocious children who start to write at home before going to school. In our work, we have found the same type of invented spelling among typically developing children. both in the US and in other countries. So it's not something that's restricted to precocious children. In some of our work, we've gone into classrooms that use a whole language approach to the teaching of reading, where children, it's assumed that children will sort of learn to spell on their own as a function of being exposed to words. So what they do is that they, this particular classroom, they give children about half an hour each morning to do writing. If the children couldn't write, it's like, well, just do the best you can. And they would come up and show the teacher what they had written, read their story to the teacher. The teacher would write in conventional spelling, but wouldn't point out, you spelled this word right, you spelled this word wrong. And the idea was that just through exposure, children's spelling will improve. So I'm going to show you an example of an invented spelling produced by children in this first grade classroom. This was a boy named Calvin, and that's what he wrote on the side. And then the little letters over on the side are his story as he read it to the teacher. Okay, but even if you didn't have the teacher's writing there, you could probably read it. Jack jumped. So neither word is spelled correctly. A spell checker would have difficulty deciphering this, but we can read it pretty well. And again, notice the types of errors that he's making. He's leaving out, for example, the M in jumped. He's writing the final D, which is the past tense morpheme, as a T instead of with an E. Anybody read this one? The boy found. What is he holding in his hand? Yeah, it's a picture of a balloon, and the balloon was happy. Okay, and that's what he read to the teacher. So you guys got that correct. My dog can read and write.
He can
read a story. So here the child is not putting spaces between the words, leaving out the T of story, a bunch of interesting errors here. And in fact, that's exactly how he dictated it. So now he thinks that reading and writing are so easy that even his dog can do it. So why do children invent these spellings that they do? Why do they make these particular types of errors? Well, some of the errors that we have seen in these examples and have been documented in more controlled research studies as well reflect children's difficulties in analyzing clusters in spoken words into phonemes. So this is phonemic analysis. Clusters are units phonologically that kind of hang together, and it can be hard for children to break them up into individual phonemes and realize that you need to write one letter for each phoneme. So we saw this with initial clusters. The last example, the child was writing story with just an S as opposed to an ST. So we seem to think of st as a unit, just need one letter to write the unit. Or another example would be writing fly as FI instead of FLY. So these errors reflected difficulty in analyzing initial consonant clusters in words. We also saw a number of examples of errors with final consonant clusters. And these too have been documented in research studies. Things like leaving out the M of jumped or leaving out the N of found. These particular examples involve what are called nasal consonants. And there's a tendency with the nasal consonant for children to think of it as being kind of part of the vowel instead of it's a separate unit on its own. And that can lead them to fail to spell that consonant when they try to write the word. So a difficulty in analyzing words into phonemes can be one cause of certain invented spellings that are not conventionally correct. even when children do succeed in breaking up words into phonemes, they may not do so in the way that is conventional according to the writing system. So they may come up with unconventional but plausible analyses. And those also may cause spelling errors. So let's give you a little test here. What do you think this might have been an attempt to write?
Truck.
Truck. And why would a child do this?
Truck.
Right, the child is breaking up the cluster, but they're thinking of the first part of the cluster as being a ch rather than a t, and in fact, it is similar to a ch. Sky. So again, when you break up the cluster sk, the second part really is similar to a g sound. If you were to take a tape recording of sky and take off the s and ask people what they hear, 95% of people would say ga. We'll try it. What about this? Dress. So the same kind of thing with the dr cluster, it sounds similar to j. Water.
A water.
So in water, we have a clap in the middle. It sounds more like a D. Water. Doesn't sound so much like a T. At least in America, most people. In England, people say water, but here we say water. Why is there no E at the end? No ER? So that's really a syllabic R. There really isn't a separate vowel sound there. The R is what's called syllabic. It really is water. So all of these errors reflect children beginning to analyze words into phonemes, but not classifying the phonemes in the same categories as conventional spelling does. And again, spell checkers would have a lot of trouble with these mistakes. Okay, you guys did so great with these. Let me give you another test. What do you think this might be?
Ball.
Could be ball, but it was actually bell.
Bell.
This was elephant. Do you see what's going on here?
Elephant.
It's the letter
L.
name. So a child hears the word elephant. We would break it up, but it's like I already have a label for elephant.
Pen.
Okay. Make. We saw that in one of the first examples. So why do you need a final E? A already says the sound A. No need for anything else. So all of these errors reflect the influence of letter names on spelling. In this country, we consider learning letter names to be very important for children. We drill children from an early age on letter names. And children use what they know. They use their knowledge of letter names in inventing spellings. In England, in contrast, letter names are not stressed. Children are not taught letter names in school. They're taught letters according to their sounds. And one sees many fewer of these types of mistakes in England. So that would be an interesting topic for discussion. Is emphasis on letter names too much in the United States? These 6 attempts here were all attempts to spell the same word as produced by different children. They were all trying to spell the same word. What word do you think it was? One of the children got it right. Hint. It was actually wet. That's right. A couple of the children were using a Y at the beginning. Why did they do that? It's the letter name again, right? The name of the letter Y starts with what. So if a child is trying to figure out what letter should I use to spell what, they need to take their knowledge of letter names, they hear the what at the beginning of Y, and they use a Y, as these 2 children did. So again, it's a mistake. It's a mistake that teachers might not understand. It's a mistake that spell checkers would definitely not understand. But it reflects children's use of letter names. What's going on with this child here? Why did they spell wet this way? This child was named Danny. And that's something that we'll get back to. Children use what they know. They may know the spelling of their own name. And so children will sometimes use the letters from their own name, reorganize them, and try to spell other words. So we've seen a couple of examples, and ideas about why children invent the spellings that they do. Just to summarize, sometimes they have difficulty breaking up words into phonemes. They might have difficulty breaking up a cluster. Sometimes they do break up words into phonemes, but they don't classify those phonemes in the same way that the writing system assumes, so they might use a CH instead of a T in this cluster. And sometimes they will use their knowledge of letter names to suggest spelling for sounds, so they might spell the I sound of try with another phoneme. This work on invented spelling brings up a number of interesting pedagogical issues, some of which Carol Chomsky talked about in her early research. How long should we let children spell using invented spelling? When should we begin stressing correct spelling? Is correct spelling something that needs to be taught, or is it something that some people say caught? It's just something that children will pick up on their own. That's the assumption of the whole language approach, that you'll pick it up on your own. Carol Chomsky and others have suggested that children should actually write before they read, because they're able to use their knowledge of phonology in inventing spellings, and that spelling should actually come before reading. And that's another interesting pedagogical issue that we could get back to. So we talked about phonologically based invented spelling, but that is not, for many children, the first step. Before invented spelling, children will sometimes produce what is called pre-phonological spelling, sequences of letters, or even sometimes sequences of symbols that aren't really letters, that are attempts to represent meaning, but that are not doing so by using letters to represent sounds in any kind of conventional way. Here's a banner that a 4-year-old boy wrote to welcome his mother home. And when his mother asked what it said, he said, "Oh, this says welcome home." But the letters that he's using here do not seem to have any relationship at all to the sounds in the words welcome home. Here's a production from the boy Calvin. We saw his spelling of Jack jumped a little while ago. This was something that he did at the very beginning of the school year before he did Jack jump. During the writing period, he wrote his name up at the top of his paper. He wrote this really nice, drew this really nice picture. And then he wrote a story up at the top using the letters ACR. He took the story to the teacher. The teacher said, "What did you write?" And he said, "This says, I like swings and I like slides and I like the sun." So again, it's pre-phonological. There doesn't seem to be any relationship between the letters and the sounds in those words. So the common idea about pre-phonological spelling is that children are randomly stringing together letters. That they don't have any useful knowledge about writing at this point, other than perhaps a knowledge of some specific letter forms. Our work has suggested, however, that pre-phonological spellers, even at this very early point of development, do have some knowledge about writing. For example, pre-phonological spelling tends to use letters and pairs of letters that are common in the writing system to which the child has been exposed. And what this means is that children from different countries who are exposed to the same writing system, but different languages, different written languages, will actually produce subtly different kinds of pre-phonological spelling, because they're using the letters and letter patterns from their language. So in one study, we looked at pre-phonological spellers in Brazil who are learning Portuguese, and pre-phonological spellers in the United States who are being exposed to English. Now in Portuguese, it's basically the same alphabet, but you know what the most common letter is in English? E. Portuguese, the most common letter is A. Portuguese, a very common letter group is AO. That's not a very common letter group in English. TH is a common letter group in English, not in Portuguese. And when we look at the pre-phonological spellers' productions, we see that even though they're not yet using letters to represent sounds, they're using the letters and letter groups more commonly that are more common in their language. So there's a correlation between how often they use a letter and letter group and how often it occurs in the writing system. So it looks like these pre-phonological spellings are not totally random. They tend to use letters and letter groups that are common in the writing system. The other thing that we see in pre-phonological spelling is children tending to use letters from their own names, and we saw the example of that earlier with Danny. So children are learning about what kinds of letter sequences are common in what they see. They see their own name a lot, so they learn that. And they also see words around them, and they learn the common letters and letter groups in those. And one interesting recent finding is that the characteristics of a child's pre-phonological spelling when they're about 4.5 years of age can actually be used to help predict their ability in conventional spelling 2.5 years later. So this was a study of children in Brazil, unlike most of the other studies that I've talked about that were with English-speaking children. And one thing that we found in this study is that the more closely the frequencies of the two-letter sequences in the child's pre-phonological spelling correlate with those in the language, the better that child is in spelling 2.5 years later. So that was one interesting result. The second interesting result of this study is that the more a child uses letters from their own name in their pre-phonological spelling, the worse their conventional spelling a couple of years later. So what this suggests is that even at this very early point in spelling development, there are differences among children. Some children are more advanced, some children are picking up characteristics of writing from a broad range of texts and trying to reproduce those when they write. Those children are further along the path, they're further along the path 2.5 years later as well. Some children are primarily picking up just the letters from their own name. Those children are less advanced as pre-phonological spellers, and then when you go back and test them a couple of years later, they're also among the less advanced spellers in their class. So these results suggest that there is something going on with pre-phonological spellers more than just randomly picking letters. We have attempted to explain what is happening here in terms of a statistical learning view about spelling. We're saying that children are picking up some of the graphic or outer properties of writing from exposure, and they're beginning to pick those up even before they learn how the letters represent specific sounds. And that makes sense because children in the United States or any modern society are exposed to writing from a very early age. It's all around them. It might even be over their crib when they come home from the hospital. They see books, they see cereal boxes, they see cans of food, they see writing on t-shirts. It would take heroic measures to shield a child from the sight of print. Print is all around them and they can't help but notice it and notice some of its characteristics. So even basic characteristics like writing tends to be horizontal in English. Certain letter shapes occur more often than others. Children can begin learning these things before they have any idea that the letters represent sounds, before they have any idea of which specific sounds the letters represent. So this is really what I'm talking about when I'm saying the statistical learning view of writing. You can begin to learn about the statistics. What's more common in the writing that I see? What's less common? Statistical learning is something that has been previously documented with spoken language. So infants are able to pick up patterns in spoken language, some syllables occurring before other syllables. Even before they know what words mean, they can begin to learn about the patterns of speech. And we're suggesting that the same thing is happening in the learning of written language. Children are picking up the patterns in the print around them. So frequencies of particular letters. I see this letter shape more than I see this letter shape. Frequencies of letter groups. Frequencies of different spatial arrangements. I see a lot of writing that goes horizontally. I don't see very much that goes vertically. And other properties as well. And the idea of statistical learning is that children can pick up probabilistic patterns. So even when a pattern isn't already known. Yes, you do see some writing that goes vertically, but you see more that goes horizontally. So even if a pattern is not all or none, children are able to use these statistical learning mechanisms to pick it up. So our conclusions about pre-phonological spelling then are that children apply their statistical learning skills to the print that they see, and they attempt to reproduce some of the features that they've observed, even before they know how the marks symbolize language, and perhaps even before they know that the marks do symbolize language. So we're saying that learning about the form of writing comes before learning about its language symbolizing function. Okay, well, we've talked about the nature of writing systems in English and pre-phonological spelling and phonological spelling, but this is certainly not the end of spelling development. There's a lot that needs to happen, and so I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about more advanced spelling. I talked earlier about how in English and in a number of other writing systems too, you can often use the context in which a sound occurs to help figure out which of several possible alternative spellings would be correct. So I want to give you a specific example of that and talk just a little bit about studies that have looked at context use in spelling. So I picked an example that I thought would be appropriate for Texas. It has to do with the sound I when it comes before N and when it comes before other consonants. So if you saw this, you would call it a pickle, right? And how do you spell I? Normally you spell I with an I, and so with a pickle you'd be right. But if you see this, and if you're from Texas, you would call it a pencil, right? Pencil. And so that's an I sound, but you should spell it with an E, and you shouldn't spell it with an I. But there's a pattern that in this particular dialect, I before N is a sound that in many other dialects is an F and is spelled with an E. So instead of just learning that I has two spellings, an I and an E, you can learn that in certain contexts it's spelled with an I, like before cup and pickle. But when you hear an I before there it's sometimes spelled with an E and sometimes spelled with an I. So by taking context into account, you know when it's always going to be an I, and when you have to worry, it could be an I, it could be an E. So that's an example of how context influences spelling. So we've done some research, not with children in Texas, but with looking at other kinds of context-sensitive patterns and how children develop the ability to use context in their spelling. And the general finding is that children do use context, but it can take several years, depending on the complexity of the pattern, for them to begin to do it appropriately. So learning to use context to spell sounds is a pretty lengthy process, a pretty difficult process. It's something where children can use their statistical learning skills. They can say, in general, when this sound is followed by this other sound, I should spell it this way. In general, when this sound is followed by this other sound, I should spell it this way. So statistical learning can help in picking up these regularities. But nevertheless, like I said, it's a lengthy process. Even adults can have difficulty using context. This is a spelling mistake that I found on a website directed toward fly fishermen. This person misspelled the word deep. And in fact, E is a sound that has two common spellings, E-E or E-A. And this person just seemed to guess between them. But in fact, there is a pattern with E. The E-E spelling usually occurs before P. Most words with E before P have E-E, like keep, deep, steep. Okay, not everyone, leap. But most words have E-E. And so if this person had learned about the contextual pattern, they should have been able to figure out that deep would be E-E. so we've just talked a little bit about more advanced spelling. In the last couple of minutes, I just want to say a little bit about implications for teaching of this kind of research. So first, to start with very young children, they learn a lot at home, and particularly according to the statistical learning view, exposure to writing is important. If you ask parents what's important at home, they'll say book reading. Reading to their children is thought to be the key, the most important thing that you can do to help them learn to read and write. As important as book reading is for learning vocabulary, for developing facility with comprehension, it's actually not that useful for learning about spellings of words. There have been some very interesting studies in recent years where people put cameras on kids' faces when they're being read to see how much time they spend looking at the words in a book versus the pictures. And anybody want to guess what's the percentage of time that a 4 or 5-year-old will spend looking at the words? 5%. So they don't really look at the words very much. So book reading, when you have these pictures competing, is not the most powerful activity for children to begin to learn about spelling. Other activities involving letters and writing where there are not pictures competing are more helpful. These activities occur from an early age and occur outside the domain of book reading. So for example, showing letters to children, writing a letter on their bag, helping them to make a greeting card and writing a word. These activities can be very helpful in teaching children about writing, in drawing their attention to basic aspects of writing, such as the fact that letters are different from pictures. Once children enter school, of course, they receive formal instruction in spelling and reading. Traditional approaches to spelling, like we talked about, are based on the idea that learning to spell words is primarily a matter of rote, visual memorization. And that approach is no longer accepted by researchers, but continues to play an important role in many classrooms. We've also mentioned briefly the whole language approach, the idea that if they're exposed to writing, children will master spelling on their own and they don't need formal instruction. This idea, too, has not been supported by research. Research supports rather the idea that phonics instruction is beneficial for spelling and for reading. Traditional phonics instruction, however, focuses on context-free rules. In many cases, children are taught this is how a certain letter is pronounced, this is how a certain sound is spelled. When they are given options, like E can be spelled as EA or EE, they are usually not taught that by considering the context, that can help them to select among the options. So a weakness of traditional phonics instruction is that it focuses on context-free rules, and it doesn't consider the use of context. Another weakness of traditional phonics instruction is that it is often given in reading instruction. It's assumed that children will just transfer what they know to spelling, but that's not necessarily the case. Our results suggest that teaching of spelling can be improved by drawing children's attention to the role of phonological context and also morphology in helping to select among alternative spellings. These considerations can be very helpful when a sound has more than one spelling in helping to select among them. It's also important to increase teachers' knowledge of how the English writing system works and of why children make the mistakes that they do. If a teacher, for example, sees a child spelling try as C-I, the teacher should realize that perhaps the child has tried to break that word up into sounds, has analyzed the first sound as being a ch, and is trying to use a C. The C is not a random mistake. Likewise, the use of I reflects knowledge of letter names. So teachers need to understand what children's errors show about the knowledge that they have. findings that I have talked about also have some implications for improving assessment of spelling. I talked earlier about how children's spelling can provide us with a lot of information about what they know. But traditional ways of scoring children's spelling just look at correct versus incorrect. And if we were to test a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, they're going to get 0 correct on a spelling test. So we're not going to get any useful information from correct versus incorrect scoring. It's important to look closely at the errors that children make and to develop other kinds of methods that can provide information about the quality of their spellings in a way that goes just beyond just correct versus incorrect. And we have developed one computerized tool for scoring spellings called Pronto. And during the discussion period, if anybody's interested, I could show you. It's on the website. I could show you a little bit how it works and the kind of thing that it's designed to do. So the general message here is that by increasing our understanding of spelling development, we can improve assessment. So just to summarize, I've talked about some different views of learning to spell. One traditional idea is that children memorize the letter string for each word. And these views have some implications for why some children are better spellers than others. Here it would suggest that what's important is rote visual memorization skills. A second idea is that children analyze words into phonemes and use context-free rules from phonemes to letters and letter groups. This is closer to the truth, but I think there's too much of a stress here on context-free rules. And for English, doesn't make good spelling. The view that I put forward today is that children apply their statistical learning mechanisms both to the print that they see around them and to the correspondences between the printed and the spoken forms. And it's this use of statistical learning that can cause children to become good spellers. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, thank my collaborators, a couple of funding agencies that have contributed to this work, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you.
Any questions?
I've got a question too. At what point should, as children go, say, 4th, 5th, or 6th grade, is there a point in time when it becomes too late to try to correct the spelling?
I don't think so. There's, in the area of spoken language development, there's evidence for a critical period where you need to learn a spoken language before a certain age in order to be fully skilled. But in the area of reading and spelling development, there is no such critical period, so it's never too late.
Could you recommend a resource to us that contains the a list of some of those patterns? For example, the bow sound before the K, how context influences spelling.
This is pretty new research, and so it hasn't gotten its way all the way into resources for teachers, but there are some research papers that deal with this. Probably the most accessible one is Kessler 2009 in Writing Systems Research, and there's another one that's a little more technical, Kessler and Treiman 2001 in Journal of Memory and Language. So I think there's a need to take some of these and put them into a really accessible form, but some of this is pretty new.
For children who are taught the specific patterns and still struggle with acquiring them, what are some additional practice or types of instructional activities you would recommend?
One pretty well-known instructional activity is teaching of phonological awareness. So one of the reasons why children might be able to verbally say that they know that P is spelled with P and R is spelled with R, but yet when they write pretty, they don't spell the cluster correctly. Their the issue seems to be breaking up the cluster into phonemes, and being able to do that kind of phonological analysis. So that would be one specific example of the kind of activity that can help with regard to some of these morphological patterns, breaking up words into morphemes, knowing that jumped is jump, and then the past tense, and the past tense is always spelled with ED. So breaking up words phonologically and morphologically.
Could you please show the Bluetooth, the mic tool for the standing assessment?
Are you going to stay for the discussion afterwards? I'll just briefly show it here.
Just briefly.
Okay, yeah, I don't. Down here. Oh, you know what? I don't have the internet here because my computer is not, but we can probably figure out how to get the internet on my computer and then I can show you, yeah. I think I can just have Texas A&M code on the computer.
Do you have an opinion on the emphasis of teaching letter names in American schools today?
My opinion is that there's too much stress on it in this
Okay.
country. I think that it can lead children to think that whenever you hear a sound that sounds like a letter name, you should spell it with that letter, and in many cases that is not the correct spelling. I think that it's useful to teach letter names because it is useful to have a label for each letter.
Right.
But I think that strict rules that, you've got to know 20 letter names before you went to kindergarten, and treating letter names as sort of the be-all and the end-all, and so much stress on learning letter names, I think that's overdone. When I'm in England and talk to people about the use of letter names here, they really can't understand it. Children there typically learn the sounds of letters before they learn the names, and English adults sometimes don't even remember the names of letters. They're not stressed very much. And there are a few issues that arise from that. For example, you're taught that this letter is a cup, and you're taught that this letter is a cup. And if you don't have letter names, what do you call the letter? So they call this one the kicking cup, and they call this one the curly cup. So it's useful to have letter names. But the sounds, knowing the sounds that the letter represent is what is more important for reading and spelling. And I think that by putting so much stress on letter names, we sometimes go a little too far.
I had a question about,
Yeah, that's right.
you mentioned how early exposure to literacy, at home context or daycare or whatnot could impact children's spoken language development. And I think that was the work of Bryce Heath and her colleagues. And you studied this and tried to see, how that could relate to their spelling development. And you mentioned a study, I think, that you've done, right, on that specific
On
slide.
this slide.
Could you elaborate on your findings?
Yeah, so
your
we've been
study design and
studying,
findings. I was just curious about that.
We've been studying parent-child conversations that occur in the home, just in the course of everyday activities. We have access to a database where 60 children were tracked from the age of 14 months to the age of 5 years old. Researchers went into their homes every 4 months and recorded an hour and a half of just everyday conversation while they were playing with toys or eating snacks or just doing what they normally do. And we've been looking at those conversations that touch on letters and writing, and they occur, we tend to think of this as something that happens when you're reading books. But these conversations occur throughout the day, just in the course of sort of normal everyday activities. You're on the floor with your truck, and the truck has a license plate on it, and you point out the letters on the license plate. So that's the kind of thing that we've been looking at. And one really, really recent finding that we have is that those parents who talk more about about the first letter of the child's name.
Uh-huh.
That seems to be something that is correlated with good literacy performance later on. That's pretty important. So that's just a really finding.
Okay, one last question from Dr. Wade.
I'm just staying on anyway, but I'm just curious, if there are any lessons from the China literature for adults studying?
That's a great question. I know that there are some studies with illiterate adults who are learning to spell and read as adults. And there's been a couple of studies comparing, for example, the spellings that they produce to the spellings that children produce. And there are a lot of amazing similarities. So it seems that the studies are not very complete, however, but it seems that there are many similarities, and this kind of goes along with what I was saying earlier. There's no critical period for learning to spell. Regardless of what age you learn, this idea about breaking up words into phonemes is very, very difficult. That's something that adults have difficulty with. If they're illiterate, they've got to learn that. It's something that children have to learn. And so the types of errors seem to be quite similar. But there's not enough research on that to really draw any strong conclusions. With regard to adults who are learning a second language, things are different there because you have the correspondences from your first language. If your first language is alphabetic, you've got the idea of breaking up words into sentences. But you have correspondences between letters and sounds that are from your first language, and you may apply those into your second language if it's the same alphabet. And so those spellings can look quite different than those of children because the adults are using correspondences from their first language, and the children who are learning this first language don't have that.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll take about a few minutes break, about 5-10 minutes, and there will be lunch. I'll get the lunch, and then we'll have an informal discussion. So thank you for those of you who are leaving now for classes or other appointments.